Liar, lunatic, or God. This is what God used to bring me to a realization of actually who Yeshua was in the year 2000. My story starts in 1958. November 1st is my birthday. I was born into a secular Jewish family, which I realize is like an oxymoron. I mean, how can you be a secular Jew? Because if if it wasn't for Abraham, if it wasn't for the Bible, there would be no Jewish people. But nonetheless, after the Second World War, a lot of people moved away. A lot of Jews moved away from God. Because after all, they figured, how could God allow 6 million of his people to be murdered? So I grew up in a house where there was no religion, there was no God to speak of. But I marched to the beat of a different drum since the time I can remember. I was like the black sheep, the rebellious one, the different one. I was also the youngest one, the puniest one. And so I had one older brother, but I was the youngest and smallest in the family. And our family was kind of dysfunctional. I have a lot of good memories, but also not so good memories of my childhood. There was a lot of strife in my family, and it seemed like all the brunt of it kind of filtered down and ended up on me. I also did not have a great time in grade school. My father thought he was doing me a favor when he convinced our school principal to allow me to enter grade school a month and a half before my time. See, the age limit to be 6 years old was September 15th. My birthday, being November 1st, meant that I was a month and a half late. My father did this to put me ahead, but actually it ended up putting me behind. Because in school, I was also the puniest and the smallest, the least able in sports, the least competitive. I was the guy that got picked last to be on a team. I grew up with a feeling of emptiness, with despair, loneliness, a feeling that no one understood me and I didn't belong anywhere. And this feeling in me never left. It just grew and grew through my childhood into my adolescent years. And as I entered young adulthood, I thought I found a solution. In the party scene in the 1980s, I began experimenting with drugs and alcohol. Let me tell you, from the first puff and the first sip, I thought I'd found my solution. All of a sudden, I was taller. I was better looking in my own mind. I was more confident. I could, walk with a kind of swagger in my step that I'd never been able to do before. I felt like I'd arrived. I felt like I'd found an answer to this emptiness, this despair, this loneliness, this darkness gnawing at my soul. But over time, as the Chinese proverb says, the man takes a drink, the drink takes a drink, the drink takes the man. This is what happened to me. Things got worse and worse in that respect until I finally bottomed out coming up to the year 2000. Well, at that time, I was blessed enough to meet a gentleman who was an Orthodox Jew. And after telling him my story, he said to me, Charles, you have a spiritual problem that demands a spiritual answer. This emptiness that you're feeling inside is never going to be satisfied by things of the world. Kind of like Jeremiah 2:13 says, you've committed two sins. One, you've forsaken me, and two, you're drinking water from broken cisterns that just cannot satisfy. I had to admit he was right. Well, I had always looked for answers in alternate and other religions, but this gentleman challenged me to perhaps give my own Jewish roots a try. He said, why don't you try Orthodox Judaism? I said, sure, I'm open to that. So back in Montreal, I went to go see Chabad, the Lubavitcher movement, and, I always do things going in with 2 feet, right? So I joined this Lubavitcher movement, and I quickly began to learn the ropes on how to dress and eat and be and do and don't do all of the things that Orthodox Jews do. Well, I became very busy very quickly, but I have to tell you that the emptiness, the darkness, the loneliness, the yearning in my heart, it didn't go away. It was still there. As a matter of fact, because I had no drugs or alcohol to cover it up, in a sense, it even felt worse. By the time I was getting through the summer and fall into the year 2000, I reached a place in my life that's called hitting bottom. I felt spiritually and morally bankrupt. And it was about that time that a person asked me, "What do you think about Jesus?" And I said, "Well, I'm a Jew. I don't think about Jesus." And this person challenged me and said, "Do you believe this person ever existed? Did Jesus ever exist?" I said, "Yes, I believe he existed. He was a good guy. He probably was a great teacher, a nice guy, but I don't believe that he was God or the Son of God or the Messiah." And this person then said, which is a C.S. Lewis quote, "Liar, lunatic, or God." I said, I don't understand where you're going with this. And this person said, "Well, if I told you I was God, you could only conclude that I'm either lying, or I'm deluded, I'm crazy, I'm a lunatic, or it's true. There is no black or white. There's no neutral ground. Now, if you don't believe that Jesus was who he said he was, meaning God or the Messiah or one with God, you have to conclude that he was a liar." And someone who would lie about something so important really could hardly be called a nice guy, right? And I had to admit, you know what? They were right. I didn't know what I was talking about. I'd never really read the Bible. I'd never really understood what a Messiah was. So I said, "I'll get back to you." Well, out of the kindness of her heart, this person referred me to a gentleman by the name of Irving Saltzman, a missionary with Chosen People Ministries in Montreal. I went to go see him. And after many discussions, after much study in the Bible and a lot of prayer, finally, on October 26th at 5:40 a.m. in the morning, I accepted Yeshua as my Lord and Savior. But let me tell you what led up to it in the final moments. I remember asking God, why am I even, concerned about whether or not Jesus is the Messiah? Why is this question so important that it's an all-consuming thing for me? And the answer came in my heart. The answer was, since I was a kid, I had a yearning for a sense of belonging. I wanted to know that I belonged. I wanted to know that there was a God, and if there was really a God, that I actually really belonged to him. I had been waiting for a sign my whole life that God truly existed. And that's when I believe God ministered a thought into my heart, which is, what if that sign is that I, by faith, accept that Yeshua is his son, that he did die for my sins, that he was raised on the third day, and that maybe he was who he said he was. And so I prayed that prayer, and I can't really explain it, but there was an almost audible voice in my gut, in my kishkas, my inner being, that immediately said, "Saved," in a way that I will never forget. Well, that day was a turning point for me. I went back up to my apartment and I opened the Bible because I wanted to see it, what it looked like. I felt like Paul, who had the scales fall from his eyes. And as I opened up the scriptures on a random page, the Lord brought me to Matthew 13. It opens with Jesus on the shoreline teaching about the parable of the four soils. And then finally in verse 10, his disciples say to him, they ask him, "Why do you always teach in parables?" And Jesus said, "The reason that I do that is because to you the secrets of the kingdom have been given, but not to them." It would be many years before I began to understand what that meant. But I believe this is what Jesus meant. He said when he came in Luke that I am bringing in an invisible kingdom in your midst. It's not a kingdom that you can say here it is or there it is. It's an invisible kingdom in your midst, right? And this is the thing, is that Jews are waiting for visible signs to confirm that the Messiah is who he says he is. When they see nation no longer lift up sword against nation, when they see, right, the lamb lie down with the wolf, and all people knowing of God, not needing to be taught, then they will say, yes, the Messiah is here. But the problem with that is they're waiting for Act 2 before Act 1. Act 1 is when the Messiah comes the first time and ushers in the invisible kingdom and is the suffering servant. The second time he comes, he will return as a king, a reigning king from Jerusalem who will usher in all the visible signs of the kingdom. You see, the world says you got to see to believe, but the scriptures say, believe and you will see. This is the kind of faith that Yeshua loves. So what God was saying through those scriptures is, to you the secrets of the kingdom have been given, is that the scales were being taken from my eyes. I was seeing the invisible kingdom within the visible realm of this world. I was seeing Yeshua for who he was. As when when Jesus asked Peter, who do you say I am? And Peter says, I say you're the Messiah. And Jesus said, and who gave you that revelation? It wasn't men who taught you that. It was God that opened your eyes. That was the day that God opened my eyes. However, seeing Jesus for who he is really only part of what's required for salvation. The second part is seeing who I was before God as an unholy sinner, before a holy God. That actually came a few years later when I suffered a very bad ski accident that nearly took my life. In those days in the hospital, I really spent some very deep, quiet time with God. And that's when I began to see my truer condition as a sinner before God and how in need I was of his salvation by grace. And all I can tell you is that since that day, my faith has kept deepening. The Lord is growing me along spiritual lines. And I think the biggest thing that I can share with you today is that not only did I turn and God is healing me, but he's bringing me to be a man, a vessel that he can use for his purpose, for his glory. And I think that's the big paradigm shift, is that the world, will sell you how to have a successful life for your benefit, how to think big for your benefit, and all this kind of stuff. But in biblical terms, God doesn't heal us just so we can have a better life. No, he heals us for his glory. He heals us so that we, like the blind man who was healed, or like the demoniac who was healed, can go out into the Decapolis, go out into the world, and we can tell people of what the Lord has done in us. In other words, we get to rewrite our story, and then we get to retell our story in a brand new way to those who would listen. Thank you for listening to my story today, for God's glory. I know it's a miracle. It seems like believing in Jesus may not be a Jewish thing to do. I was told by the Orthodox Jews when I became a believer in Jesus that I was no longer Jewish. Today, I know how false that is. Before I came to faith in Jesus, I didn't really understand or know or how to observe a Shabbat. I didn't know what the full calendar of biblical holidays was in Leviticus 23. I never read the Hebrew scriptures with any kind of seriousness. I didn't know what prophecy was. I didn't know what God's promises were to the Gentiles and to the Jewish people. I'm only learning about these things now as a saved Jew. So I know today I'm actually more Jewish than ever. According to the promise of Abraham, I am a completed Jew in Messiah. Thank you for listening to my story. Blessings to you. In Jesus' name, B'Shem Yeshua HaMashiach. Shalom.